I will share with you that we have a theory of change that I generally adopt when I'm focused on transformation of culture. It is called AURA, A-U-R-A. And in a nutshell, it suggests that in order to advance sustainable change, we need to create a context for awareness and understanding. What is the issue? What are the causes of the issue? Beyond awareness and understanding, we need to provide an opportunity for reflection. How is this issue relevant to me and my work? Which can then lead to informed and sustained action. The expectation then is that this is a process that will unfold over time, and today's installment is just the beginning. As our first step in this training this week, we will focus on creating awareness and a shared understanding of anti-racism as a framework. Note that I'm merely providing a summary of anti-racism given that the time we have to work with. I can provide additional resources if you would like to delve more deeply, and there are many more that are accessible to you on the web on this subject. We hope also to get to the point of beginning to generate some initial self-reflection and some actionable items at the individual level. Our norms. So given the focus of our discussion, the first norm is one, center the voices of BIPOC participants, Black, Indigenous, people of color. Remember, we're doing this training explicitly to learn about and understand the challenges that are imposed interpersonally and systemically on individuals who are often in the minority. So this session is intended to center the perspectives and experience of communities who have both shared and distinct histories of oppression and discrimination. Norm number two, respect others and their contributions. Listen to learn, not to refute, not to debate. Please don't interrupt. Three, open-mindedness should prevail. I encourage each of you to adopt a growth mindset and appreciate what you can learn and how you can expand your beliefs. We invite you to balance self-reflection, learning, and emotional investment in this process. And finally, perspective taking is highly recommended. Consideration of others' experiences and points of view is critical to developing empathy and promoting a culture of inclusion. Next slide. These norms are easy to remember, and one way to do so is to think about the acronym they create. CROP. This is apropos, given that our expectation should be one of nurturing relationships and understandings that can lead to personal growth. So please keep that in mind. I'll begin with the basic root word race. What is race? Well, race is a socially constructed categorical system that was created by people in power in order to maintain control of resources. Race is not based in biology, nor has the concept ever been defined consensually by the whole of society. Again, race is not a biological category. It's simply a system of classification that has evolved over the course of history and that has been maintained for the sake of power and wealth accumulation. In fact, it is often said that racism preceded and was used to justify the development of this concept of race. Next. Racism, however, is real. The racial disparities that I touched upon at the beginning of my talk appear across multiple contexts. And in fact, in engineering, number 11, there has been little progress in the representation of racial minorities and women in higher education over the past decades. So I pulled this out of the 10-year window report that comes out by the numbers on engineering. And you see the percentage of women as well as ethnic racial minorities in 2005, degrees being granted, and then again 10 years later in 2015. There is not much change over the course of this decade. And there's probably a more recent report or two, there is a time lag there, but the pattern is very similar. Why do you suppose these numbers are so low? Who does it benefit to keep these proportions down? Who does it exclude? Who gets penalized by these proportions? Is this underrepresentation fair? And by whose judgment, if so? Furthermore, given the low numbers of these groups and their experiences of isolation and likely exclusion, probably these are things that have persisted across time. Do you think fulfillment of their expectations for a career in engineering were met, or were they thwarted? And in fact, I wonder, was numerical distinctiveness or isolation something that came up for any of you in your listing for category of surprises and shocks in entering engineering? So this is just an example. It gives us an understanding of the starkness in disparities in outcomes that are faced by people of color, as well as women, and of course, women of color. And so then the question becomes, how do we go about making change in the status quo? How do we shift gears and address anti-racist practice in order to create more equitable outcomes for all? What are anti-racist practices? And might their adoption yield higher rates of participation and success for BIPOC in engineering? This is by Yoder's By the Numbers. It's a publication that happens on a regular basis. So I can provide that resource if you send me an email. Okay, next, let's talk about anti-racism. Anti-racism and racism are both rooted in beliefs and behaviors. So what does it mean to be anti-racist? Well, anti-racism involves beliefs and actions. On a personal level, to be an anti-racist, it means you hold the belief that there are no inherent deficits in one versus another racial group. So there are no inferior racial groups. If you're anti-racist, you believe this. Further, you eschew white supremacy as an ideology. So just in general, ask yourself, which of these beliefs do I endorse? Next, on a systems level, being anti-racist means that you are able to recognize that racism is more than just a personal belief and is in fact reflected in the system of indoctrination and an essential part of American history. You understand that racist practices, structures, policies, and beliefs have historically existed and do so currently in our nation, and that they benefit white people. Now, I don't have time to go through the full history lesson, but there are many resources at your disposal to ascertain the veracity of these statements. Finally, if you're an anti-racist, you acknowledge that racism shapes society in both obvious and subtle ways, and thus limits our nation's overall ability to become a better place for all. How competitive can we be globally if we're really excluding a large portion of women and minorities from fields like engineering? Again, I would ask you, which of these beliefs is consistent with your way of thinking? And which of these assertions seem to be challenging to you? Next, as a behavioral pattern, being anti-racist means that you readily identify the ways in which whites benefit from systems of discrimination, in particular, anti-Black discrimination. Further, behaviorally, you're willing to raise awareness in yourself and in others of how racism impacts people of color. You actively work to dismantle racist systems and institutions, inclusive of racist practices, structures, policies, and beliefs at all levels. Are these behavior patterns ones that you think apply to you? Are some of these behavior patterns challenging to you? What would it look like in your school or work if anti-racist practices were present? What would student admissions and evaluation look like? What would resource allocation look like if we're talking about space or travel funds or grants or awarding of sabbaticals? What would promotion and pay rates be like across different ethnic, racial groups, gender groups, et cetera? How would we value the voices of all people when it comes to decision making? How would we count and value service to underserved populations, whether it's with students or whether it's with the community? And how would we value the welcoming, the reaching out to underrepresented persons who do join our units to make them feel welcome and belonging? So what would that look like if in fact there was an anti-racist norm in your place of employment? Next, the term anti-racist conveys an intentional orientation and approach. An anti-racist actively engages in behavior to advance fairness and equity. Now, how does that compare with the opposite of anti-racist, which is racist beliefs and actions? Well, on a personal level, racism means you believe in hierarchy as a function of race, and typically it means you endorse white supremacy ideology. On a systemic level, racism means you perceive that racial differences justify differential outcomes. You endorse the notion that people have equal access and opportunity when in fact they do not. And furthermore, it would mean that on a systemic level, you believe that merit and effort and not societal constraint determine outcomes for people from different racial groups. On a behavioral pattern, racism means that you accept, prefer, and even defend the status quo of racial disparities. You readily deny or refuse to learn about the experiences and challenges faced by BIPOC, and you take no action to change unfair practices, structures, policies, or beliefs at any level. And again, I would ask you, are any of these approaches, thoughts, behaviors, things that you endorse or that apply to you? Next slide. Another interesting comparison is the term non-racism. What does non-racism really mean? Well, despite arguments to the contrary, there really is no middle ground. You're either a racist or an anti-racist. There is no neutral ground between equality and non-equality. The term non-racist is in fact a fallacy in that it reflects complicity with the current system. Not taking active steps to dismantle racism means you choose to ignore at minimum, and at worst, to support current patterns of discrimination and oppression. The same holds true for terms like colorblind or race neutral. They convey a disinclination to acknowledge racial disparities and inequalities, let alone taking action to dismantle those. So one either believes problems are rooted in the groups of people as a racist, or locates the roots of problems in power and policies as a non-racist. One either allows racial inequalities to persist as a racist, or confronts racial inequalities, inequities as an anti-racist. The bottom line is that one either endorses the idea of a racial hierarchy as a racist, or racial equality as an anti-racist. Next. Note also that people of all racial and ethnic backgrounds can be racist or non-racist. The problem of race has always been at its core the problem of power, not the problem of immorality or ignorance or inherent characteristics. It's not who you are or what you look like. It's what you believe and what you do that either leads you down the path of racism or anti-racism. 18, please. So as a summary, racism is a system comprised of three main components: racial inequities, policies that create and maintain those inequities, and racist ideas that justify these policies. Click the second half. By contrast, anti-racism comprises a set of anti-racist policies justified by anti-racist ideas that produce racial equality. There is good news here, however. There is a choice to be anti-racist. People can unlearn racism and become anti-racist. So the term racist and anti-racist are descriptive labels for behavior. They are not permanent identities. People are capable of transformation as long as they're willing to view inequalities in terms of power and politics, rather than blaming them on racial groups' inherent characteristics. So you can choose to become anti-racist. Next. Granted, it may not be an easy transition for most of us, given one, our system of education and its inclusion of the full human tapestry of narratives and experience. So what we have learned from the time we were children has been very supportive of a more hierarchical racist viewpoint. And so we have to think back and realize that there's a lot of unlearning to do that. Secondarily, we've been socialized to see racial disparities as normative, so we don't even question them most of the time. And finally, the transformation is challenging because it requires the recognition on our part that there must be a shift in the balance of opportunities and benefits that are accrued by those who have held positions of privilege. And I would argue that most of us present here today have privilege in one form or another. And so we have to recognize whether that privilege really was earned or was based on a system of discrimination and racism. Next, despite these challenges, however, I have a brief concept that I'm going to share with you that can ease the path to anti-racism. I would like to introduce you to the ABCs of anti-racist practice. And what do I mean by ABC? Well, by ABC, I'm going to draw from a concept in my field of social psychology, which is known as attitude behavior consistency. And this concept simply states that we hold our attitudes or our stable beliefs and dispositions. And as we hold these stable beliefs and dispositions, they help guide and predict our behavior. So what we have up here goes out and is transformed by our very actions into interactions with the world. And in many cases, this attitude behavior consistency is quite true, quite predictable. It means we have integrity. What we say we believe, we do. But research also demonstrates that we have instances in which the consistency between what we say we believe and how we behave or what we say is in fact low. In other words, we claim to have certain values, such as being proponents of clean environments, acknowledging the value of good diet and exercise, advancing safety, upholding tenets of democracy, and caring for the poor. These are all beliefs, attitudes, values that we espouse. How often, however, do we choose to bike or use mass transit instead of driving alone in our cars? How regularly do we exercise and avoid sugars and fats? Do we minimize trash we produce or the plastics that we rely on? What percentage of our income do we devote to charitable causes? And how do we speak out against voter disenfranchisement? The list goes on. There is a disparity between what we say we believe and what we actually do. By the same notion, do we really abide by and embrace the constitutional proclamation that we are all created equal? If so, then, do we promote gender and race equality or the rule of fairness? Do we evaluate others' work merely on its merit, or do we consider the individual's identities as part of the equation? Do we consider ourselves good Samaritans who love our neighbors as we love ourselves? Or are we fine with justice applicable only to those who are white or well-to-do and stand back and do nothing when BIPOC people are treated differently and poorly and unfairly? Why did it take the George Floyd murder to create movement on Black Lives Matters or racial justice, if indeed we embraced equality all along? Quite notably, anti-racist practice is not too different from the concepts embedded in our founding documents and rules of justice, if you think about it. However, we deviate in the application of those values and principles. The result is incredibly low attitude behavior consistency. Our values around justice are not reflected in our behaviors toward communities of color. We're not able to predict our behavior from our beliefs, often because we don't see the specific instance in relation to the broader belief. So click one more time here, Claire. When it comes to certain groups, those that we belong to, we apply the value. So attitude behavior consistency is high. But when it concerns members who we perceive to be in the out group, then that attitude behavior consistency, the ABC, breaks down. Recall, however, that race is not biologically real. So those groups have been created for the sake of power and politics. And we have unquestioningly adopted those socially constructed boundaries. Wouldn't it just make a lot more sense to apply the same rules of fairness and equity across the board? That way, our ABCs would be in order, and we would not be compelled to display low consistency between our values around justice and our implementation or behaviors in that arena. We would indeed be more true to our broader beliefs if we considered everybody to be in our in group. So that is a way to think about anti-racism. It helps you have more integrity around your beliefs related to justice. And thinking that way makes anti-racist practice more accessible to you now, Make it a part of your integrity. And that is the key for us today. So our goals are as follows. We want to think about what it means to consider all groups equal in competence and motivation, especially in the academy where we've already vetted all the people that we've invited through the doors, be they students, faculty, or staff. We recruited them because we thought they were good. So let's treat them that way. As well, our goal is to identify policies and practices in our respective ambits that violate this norm of fairness. We know what fairness looks like. We can identify it easily. So let's start doing that. Finally, our goal today is to commit to change ourselves and the systems of which we are a part in order to ensure equity across all our members. So these are our goals. All groups are equal. Let's identify those practices and policies that violate fairness. And let's commit to changing ourselves and the systems in which we are embedded in order to ensure equity.